From the Lever's reader-supported newsroom, this is Lever Time. I'm David Sirota. For months, Republicans have been in a red panic over New York City mayoral candidate Zohran Mamdani's proposals for government-owned grocery stores, free public buses, and government-funded childcare. But guess who just upped the socialist ante? That's right. Comrade Donald Trump himself is seizing the proverbial means of production. After a squabble with the CEO of microchip maker Intel, the U.S. government now owns 10% of the company, converting a previous $10.8 billion subsidy into an actual equity stake. But those quick to criticize this move as just another Trumpian power grab could be chasing a red herring. Senator Bernie Sanders was one of the first to propose that multi-billion-dollar government grants to chip makers were just another corporate giveaway, unless taxpayers got actual protections and an ownership stake in the deals so that we get a return on our investment. Today on Lever Time, I'm talking to an economist and a journalist who've been studying the rise of what's known as state capitalism. What's actually changing here with how America bails out and invests in corporations? Are we on a slippery slope into economic authoritarianism, or is this an unlikely gateway to the people's economy? And if the U.S. government is buying stakes in big companies, can Donald Trump be trusted to prioritize the public interest rather than using those ownership stakes to enrich himself and his family? That's all coming up on today's show.
I mean, this guy is completely perverted capitalism, Donald Trump. It's crony capitalism. It's whatever, you pay him off, give him a phone call. I mean, these illegal tariffs.
That's California Governor Gavin Newsom.
It's just perverse that they could be shaping the Democratic Party in the context of the socialist brand, when in fact, this guy is the leading nationalist and socialist of our time.
Yep, that's the Democratic governor of one of the bluest states in the United States on a podcast claiming that a conservative Republican president is a socialist after that president seized the means of production. Feels like a political episode of Freaky Friday. So what's going on here? Well, let's back up a little. Cue the background music. Sorry, wrong track. This particular story starts with the microchip making giant Intel, which you probably know from those blue Intel Inside slogans emblazoned on PCs. Or perhaps you recognize Intel's audio jingle at the end of all those computer commercials. Intel is one of only a few American manufacturers that make microchips, those tiny building blocks inside every computer, smartphone, and car made today. And that makes Intel an essential building block of the entire American economy.
They're critical to the emerging technologies that will power tomorrow's economy, like artificial intelligence and advanced communications.
That was President Joe Biden in 2024. Over the years, Intel has been struggling to keep up with competitors in China as chip manufacturing shifted overseas. And that's a problem for U.S. national security, as the American government relies on chip semiconductors for key infrastructure and military technology.
We invented those chips here in America. We invented them. We made them move. We modernized them. We used to have 40% of this market, and over time we stopped making them.
So in 2022, Biden and Congress passed something called the CHIPS and Science Act, which provided billions of dollars in grants to Intel and companies like it to help upgrade their operations. But at the time, Senator Bernie Sanders spotlighted a big problem. We were giving Intel, this private corporation, a huge pile of taxpayer money with no strings attached, no guarantees that the company wouldn't use the grants to enrich its executives and shareholders, no promises that the company wouldn't lay off workers, and no protections to make sure that taxpayers get a return on our investment.
If private companies are going to benefit from generous taxpayer subsidies, $76 billion, the financial gains made by these companies must be shared with the American people, not just wealthy shareholders.
Back in 2022, Senators Sanders and Elizabeth Warren wrote a letter urging Congress to put up guardrails to ensure that this massive handout to technology companies actually benefited American taxpayers more than it enriched shareholders. Sanders and Warren also sponsored an amendment that would have banned chip makers who get federal grants from using the money to buy back their stocks, which is a sneaky Wall Street tactic to drive up returns for investors. And importantly, their amendment would have changed those grants to chip makers into equity investments. The government wouldn't just be giving the money away. The government would get ownership stakes in the companies in return for the grants.
Does that sound really unreasonable? If these guys are going to make huge profits based on this investment, don't you think maybe the taxpayers of this country who gave them the money might be able to get some of those benefits back?
But the amendments to the bill were eventually voted down, largely by Democrats. A few years later, predictable shenanigans ensued. While raking in billions of dollars of government money, Intel eliminated 15% of its workforce, giving its fired CEO a nearly $8 million severance package. Then in August of this year, President Donald Trump called for Intel's new CEO to resign over what was called his highly conflicted investments in Chinese companies. So Trump ordered a White House meeting with the Intel CEO demanding answers. And that's when President Trump became Comrade Trump, storming in with a shocking announcement.
I said, I think you should pay us 10% of your company. And they said yes.
Yeah, okay, that's not exactly a line out of the Communist Manifesto. In fact, it sounds more like a line from The Art of the Deal.
He walked in wanting to keep his job, and he ended up giving us $10 billion.
So, in essence, it appeared to be a weird alliance between Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, which has forged a similarly weird alliance between Democrats like California Governor Newsom and far-right Republicans like Kentucky Senator Rand Paul, who went on the attack with the language of the Red Scare.
I think it's a big mistake to have government ownership of things, and of course it's a step towards socialism.
The Trump administration's response was to double down.
Lockheed Martin makes 97% of their revenue from the U.S. government. They are basically an arm of the U.S. government.
That's Trump's Secretary of Commerce, Howard Lutnick, implying that military contractors like Lockheed Martin or Palantir will be the next to have their stocks bought up by the U.S. government.
I tell you, the way it has been done has been a giveaway.
If this all sounds vaguely familiar, that's because you may be remembering that what's happening here isn't as new and novel as it may seem. You may remember that not so long ago, the U.S. government bought equity stakes in the insurance giant AIG during the financial crisis, and the U.S. government bought equity stakes in General Motors a few years ago. Back then, as now, the moves raised some huge questions. Are government-owned businesses a slippery slope into a socialist regime? Or are they simply the government making sure the public, meaning the taxpayer, gets a stake in good old-fashioned capitalism? And what about Comrade Trump here? Is he really just trying to protect the taxpayer and create a dictatorship of the people? Or is this actually another maneuver designed to grab more power for himself and gain control of companies to squeeze them for his own personal gain? That's what we're going to figure out right after the break. Welcome back to Lever Time. To make heads or tails of the Trump administration's alleged socialist pivot, I called up Professor Bob Hockett and journalist Harold Meyerson.
I'm Robert Hockett, professor of law and finance over at Cornell University, used to work at the New York Fed and at the International Monetary Fund, basically a kind of lefty finance guy for our purposes.
I'm Harold Meyerson. I've been an editor of the American Prospect magazine since 2001, sometimes executive editor, currently editor-at-large. Before that, I was the executive editor of the LA Weekly, and I've been doing journalism with sort of a democratic socialist slant for a very long time.
Hockett and Meyerson both think some version of Trump's Intel deal, which they call state-backed capitalism, could be a good thing for America, with the right guardrails. But how should it all play out? I started by asking Bob Hockett why U.S. government-owned equity stakes are a good idea, at least in theory?
Conceptually, it can be quite helpful for a number of reasons. If the collective, if the polity, the public sector, is actually helping to keep a business afloat or is essentially ensuring the continued survival of a business, it makes sense, right, that the public itself would derive some of the benefit. But more importantly, I think, is that it's a lot easier, I think, to sort of guide or at least exercise a salutary influence on what a firm does from the inside than from the outside. In other words, regulators are oftentimes finding themselves faced with difficulties in getting access to the kinds of information that they need in order to regulate properly. We go through cycles during which regulators are more lax or less lax. As soon as the government is viewed as a kind of an outsider or an exogenous sort of actor, rather than an entity that's sort of deeply implicated in the actions of our modes of enterprise, it even changes the mindset, right? People tend to view then any kind of government action as a kind of necessary evil at best and an often unnecessary evil at worst, right? Whereas if instead we, the public sector, are operating from the inside, we dispense with that sort of presumption against action or presumption against opining or trying to influence things, because we dispense with the notion that this is somehow an exogenous action, right? Something from the outside, something alien. It becomes part and parcel of the governance of the firm itself internally. And it seems to me that that's crucial. That turned out to be the case, and it turned out to be very importantly the case during the effort to get out of the Great Depression, and even more importantly, during the effort to mobilize for the Second World War effort.
Tell us a little bit about that.
When it came time to sort of mobilize for the Second World War effort, we had a very tiny aircraft industry, very small shipbuilding industry. We certainly weren't able to sort of mass produce war material, war equipment, or anything of that kind at the scale that was required for, what everybody saw, I think, or foresaw as a kind of a looming war. And the reason was fairly obvious, and that is that the effort to produce these sorts of things requires the collaborative activities of multiple sectors. Right? Just to take one example, to build warships, mass-produce warships, we decided we had to build a lot more shipyards, a lot more shipbuilding facilities. One was Richmond, California, and indeed the city of Richmond, California owes its existence more or less to the shipbuilding, the war shipbuilding industry. Now, in order to do that, it wasn't just a matter of building a factory, right? You needed to build entire neighborhoods where workers could live. You needed schools where their kids could go and learn. You needed power generation and power transmission. You needed roads. You needed medical facilities. You needed grocery. You needed essentially to build a little tiny civilization node in a spot where it hadn't existed before. And that requires the activities of a lot of industries if we are indeed a private sector or mixed economy with a significant private sector. And that required some kind of coordination. And there is no profit to be had by coordinating in that way. There's no private sector entity that can do that coordinating. So it's essentially what we did is we had the public sector get involved, and essentially we formed these sort of public-private boards, and we also put public figures on the boards of the nominally private sector firms themselves to ensure that you had sort of everybody on the same page, everybody basically sharing a common mind in order to get the job done that was this common project.
Harold, I want to hear from you. What are the concerns and arguments perhaps against this, considering that, as Bob suggested, we have done this before, and we've done it more recently with Obama and GM and AIG. What's your take on how this has worked out more recently? Were there enough safeguards? Was it a fumble? What were some of the arguments against state capitalism or state equity stakes?
Well, most of those arguments came from the right. I would add that there is kind of a third alternative to either a public stake in a company or regulation, and that is industrial policy. That was really the hallmark of Joe Biden's presidency. The government felt the need to encourage the growth of major industries, severing their need on fossil fuels, which are profoundly dangerous to the future of the planet, humans included. So they incentivized factories that would build electric cars, that would come up with alternative ways of energy, solar and wind, for instance. So it was really trying, in a sense, like Bob said, as we were trying to create a defense industry and everything that went along with it in the early years of World War II, This was trying to create an industry that met the public's needs for transportation and things like that, that was not dependent on fossil fuels. And it produced, among other things, a boom in factory construction, because obviously you need different kinds of factories to build electric cars than to build gas-powered cars, that sort of thing. But as I said, we've had industrial policy for a very long time. It's part of sort of the conservative vision of what we should be doing. They don't label it as such, and therefore all the breaks given to the oil companies were never labeled as industrial policy when that's exactly what they were.
Okay, so I hear we can take ownership stakes, equity stakes. We can do nothing. We can just hand corporations money and let them do whatever they want with no benefits accruing to the taxpayer, to the public. Or we can have industrial policy, which essentially uses incentives, tax credits, or sometimes strategic tariffs to, I'm sure conservatives would say, to pick winners and losers. But really what it is to say, we need X or Y industry for the national interest. Therefore, we have to try to develop that here. I guess I would ask then the question to you to follow that up, Harold. Is industrial policy at odds with buying stakes in companies? Can they work in tandem, or is one better than the other?
Sure, they can work in tandem. As to whether one is better than the other depends on the specific situation. If you labeled what the government did at the outset of World War II, or in the year and a half leading up to our involvement in World War II, that was an industrial policy, but it was also, through the War Production Board, as Bob said, and other means, a way of addressing this. I would also point out that one of the members of the War Production Board was a very, very prominent union leader, Sidney Hillman, and that kind of relates to the Biden effort, not entirely successful, to use industrial policy with one of the criteria that companies had to meet being neutrality towards unions, decent conditions for workers, etc. Some of that never was able to clear the Senate, but you have kind of parallel efforts in both cases to ensure that not only are you creating an industry which otherwise would not be created by the market at that time, and to ensure that the workers in that new industry aren't exploited. So using that as one example, I find industrial policy and a public share in corporations to be more complementary than not.
I think it's worth drawing a kind of conceptual distinction between industrial policy on the one hand and specific industrial policy levers on the other. And we can think of the taking of equity stakes as simply one lever, but there are many others too, like making credit available on more favorable terms, by subsidizing in various ways, by adopting strategic tariff policies that protect infant industries or vulnerable industries. There's all manner of policy lever, if I can trade on the name of the lever, of course, by definition, compatible with industrial policy writ large as a kind of overall orientation toward the private sector on the part of the public sector.
All right, let's zoom out for a second. Rand Paul, as an example, the senator from Kentucky, Republican, his argument is that the government effectively should not have direct ownership of anything, and that whether it is Obama having the government take equity stakes in GM or Trump in exchange for grants having the US government take equity stakes in Intel, that this is just dressed up socialism, that it is, as I said, picking winners and losers, not letting the free market do what the invisible hand would do. Bob, what's your response to that?
I mean, first of all, the word socialism it almost ought to be retired, it seems to me, in contexts like this, right? Because in essence, what we're always talking about, it seems, is degrees of public sector involvement and kinds of public sector involvement. Pure socialism, presumably, would be the public sector owning everything 100% and calling all the shots, right? It would be, in effect, to democratize the economy to whatever degree it democratized the polity, right? So the voting public that determines your public servants in Congress would also then, through them, sort of indirectly be determining everything that happens in all units of production and all units of service provision in the economy that are currently private sector. That's what socialism would be. Indeed, we have socialism in that form in particular sectors. For example, most cities' police forces are socialist in in Mr. Paul's sense, because there's no private sector involvement in them, at least no legitimate private sector involvement in them. We certainly hope that there's no private sector involvement in them, right? Similarly, in many places, the fire department is a purely public sector institution. It is entirely socialized. In other words, so is the military. So is any number of other public sector institutions, including that institution called Congress, which legislates, which last I checked is also a public sector institution, even if it's largely bought by private sector institutions or people. But it's crucial, of course, that we view that as corruption, right? So that's the first point that's worth noting. So that means then that the next question is, all right, what is the appropriate mix? Because we have indeed had a mixed economy all along, right? And Mr. Paul is correct, of course, that it's entirely possible when the public sector is involved via the medium of ownership stakes to end up becoming corrupt and to get the particular business firm or whatever off mission, or to be picking winners and losers on the basis of criteria that have nothing to do with the public purpose of the firm itself, namely efficient production. But note that happens in any regime imaginable, right? I mean, basically, if public figures who regulate institutions can also, of course, engage in shakedown behavior or end up being corrupted or what have you. Indeed, that seems to be happening all the time. Similarly, private sector figures within private sector institutions are themselves often corrupt, right? You know, how many scandals have we become aware of over the years of this or that CEO or this that board member or this or that executive, right, misusing his or her particular role in the firm in order then, in effect, to commandeer the firm to his or her own purposes, including Mr. Trump when he had private sector interests, right? I doubt many people would think that the firms that Mr. Trump himself ran or partly owned and operated were run for the benefit of anybody but himself, even when he had outside lenders and outside investors. And so for that very reason, it seems to me that Mr. Paul is just not really saying anything at all. He's sort of pointing something out that's essentially universally true and therefore not relevantly true at all when it comes to making public policy.
Coming up, I ask Harold Meyerson and Bob Hockett if they think Donald Trump resembles a comic book anti-hero in his uncanny ability to take a good idea and muck it all up. Welcome back to Lever Time. Harold, I want to turn to your argument about Donald Trump. Now, here's the metaphor that I use for Donald Trump. I think of Donald Trump in many ways as sort of bizarro Superman, right? Like there's Superman and then there's bizarro Superman. And the idea being that Donald Trump as bizarro Superman takes these ideas that you can imagine being implemented in a positive and constructive way that can be good ideas that arguably Democrats could have taken and implemented in a good way. And Trump takes them and then uses them in a bizarre, corrupt, bad, evil way. And it seems to me that when we're talking about equity stakes, that's essentially the concern. You wrote a piece about this for the American Prospect, and you quoted the famous American socialist and DSA founder Michael Harrington saying any idiot can nationalize. So lay out your argument about why we should be specifically concerned about what Trump will do with those equity stakes.
Well, there's a adage, a famous saying attributed to the French Bourbon king Louis XIV, which was, "I am the state." And I think for Trump, what he's doing when he takes the 10% stake in Intel or imposes a tax on NVIDIA, permitting it to produce in China, this is viewed simply from the prism of Trump himself, in which every governmental question becomes a transactional question in which he, Trump, needs to be perceived as winning. There was a piece in one of the papers about the efforts of Chinese President Xi to form a rival alliance of major nations opposed to the U.S. And I was thinking, how is this different from sort of the Cold War dynamic of presumably capitalist nations versus communist nations, democracies versus state, Leninist tyrannies or what have you? And I realized the major difference is that we can't, with Trump, actually say that, well, we represent the West, we represent democracy. Trump's view of his own power, I find to be more that of a pre-democratic, autocratic monarch than I do any head of a modern government. And therefore, when you talk about an ideological difference that was at least apparent during the Cold War, I can't say that Trump ideologically represents any of the things which we at least used to profess to stand for and imperfectly did stand for. So when he takes over Intel with a 10% stake, he's reacting to the fact that he doesn't like the CEO, that he wanted the CEO fired, really reaching into any aspect of American society, be it economic, be it a business, or be it culture, or be it whatever. I mean, he's trying to exert control over law firms, over universities, over a whole host of non-governmental agencies that he is using whatever power he can have or claim to override them. And he has to get what is perceived as a public share, but really is a recognize that this is another Trump victory share. It's a very personalist version of state capitalism, which honestly, I can't say the Democrats would have been opposed to it. I would say it's more accurate to say the Democrats would not have even conceived of it being possible.
Well, they did conceive of it being possible in the sense of, again, I go back to AIG and GM, right?
But they didn't conceive of it in a personalist
Correct, right.
vein. That's what the Democrats would not have conceived of, that this was a power play by Obama, let us say, to really exert his power, personal power over the auto industry.
So there's not a distinction between Donald Trump, the person, and the government, the sort of the public sector. From all that we can detect, his motives are entirely, I am the government. It was that famous line, by the way. It reminds me of Tom DeLay was quoted. Tom DeLay was the former House Majority Whip back in the Bush years, who at one point was quoted saying, I am the federal government, right? And it was a very controversial quote at the time,
Yes.
But I do think that is exactly how Trump sees it. So I think then the next question is, okay, let's stipulate that Trump's motives are, as my kids would say, they're sus, right? His motives are sus, right? And I saw a Treasury official this week, a former Treasury official, point out that, for instance, there's this golden share agreement that the White House negotiated with a Japanese steel company, Nippon Steel,
Right,
to acquire U.S. steel, and it vests governance rights in Donald Trump by name.
Yes, I saw that.
Yes, and this Treasury official writes that would grant Trump the ability to block plant closures, which I'm like, well, okay, that doesn't sound so bad. But then, and influence over other key business decisions. I think, Harold, I want to stick with you for one more minute here. Like, walk us through what, because people hear, oh, Donald Trump can block plant closures he doesn't like. It's like, well, that doesn't sound so bad. What's the dystopian version of what Donald Trump could do for Donald Trump, right? Like, give us some scenarios.
Well, he could, in theory, create some kind of payment to himself or his family. He could order that his family, as distinct from the federal government, gets its own golden share in Nipponized U.S. steel. I've been in steel mills. There are distinct production lines for things like military equipment and buildings, when he could direct it to go only for military equipment if he thinks that that's what he needs. He ordered his Space Force to move from Colorado to Alabama. He could direct it to produce steel for whatever facility has got to come up in Alabama. He could direct it to cut wages to therefore boost the shareholder payouts. He could direct it to do, buybacks from which he could benefit. There are all kinds of things. If he's in the role of a CEO running amok, which in theory he could be, he could do damn near anything.
So I want to ask Bob how worried you are about this sort of bizarro Superman, bizarro Donald Trump, doing all of the bad things, right? Let's take a look at what ownership stakes are being bought, what could be bought. Are there safeguards in place? Are there any checks on Trump doing terrible things? Like, what are you worried about when you look at this?
In essence, the great paradox of Trump is that he's made thinkable again many things that used to be commonplace that were really due to be made thinkable again, but weren't going to be made thinkable by mainstream Democrats, and certainly weren't going to be made thinkable by mainstream Republicans. Among those, of course, would be strategic tariff policy, taking an interest in industrial policy to reindustrialize the country, make us make things again. I used to say, instead of make America great again, make America make again. He's made these things thinkable, and he's even put sort of proto-policies kind of on the public agenda again that could, in theory, make that stuff happen. He's probably even responsible indirectly, given that he highlighted all of that stuff during his first term, for Biden's having centered it or made it a centerpiece of his own campaign in 2020. That's the good news here. The scary thing long term is that in making these things thinkable, he might also have discredited them, because if they come to be Pavlovianly associated with his own corruption, and this all gets back to Harold's, I think, quite apt observation of Louis XIV's quote, right, that l'état c'est moi, insofar as he encourages the public to think, or people like Rand Paul to think, that industrial policy means essentially Trumpifying everything or giving Trump ownership in everything, insofar as he makes people think that strategic tariff policy basically means slapping 50% tariffs on India, who we were cultivating as an ally simply because they didn't nominate Trump, because Modi didn't nominate Trump for a Nobel Prize for something that he never even did, then it might be very difficult to recover those things another time, for them to be made thinkable again sometime in the future after the present nightmare ends, assuming that it does end.
I want to just agree with you vehemently on this point, that the power of negative partisanship, and that's kind of a political term for if my opponent makes a good point, I can, or there's a nugget of a good point that my opponent makes, I can never concede that point forever. I can never concede that there is a good point, because if I concede that, then I will be demonized by my own side. Bernie Sanders, as an example, and Elizabeth Warren proposed equity stakes in chip companies in exchange for the U.S. government grants. And it's in some quarters, they were flamethrowered for helping Donald Trump, right? That anything Trump touches, a Democrat or a progressive cannot touch for fear of being demonized. And if you extrapolate that, the problem is that anything he touches policy-wise then gets, through the power of negative partisanship, that becomes a Republican issue, and the Democrats feel the need to portray themselves as against it, whether it's trade policy, whether it's taking equity stakes, whether it's should the Fed be more democratic, et cetera, et cetera. And I agree with you. Donald Trump either opens up the horizons for Democrats, or he toxifies them, Trumpifies them, and shuts it down for another era. Harold, I just want to ask you, like, how do the Democrats navigate this, right? Or progressives, Democrats, labor, how should they think about, well, Donald Trump, like, there's a nugget of a good point in here, but he's going to screw it up and make it all bad. But we don't want to foreclose on using the power, for instance, to take equity stakes. We don't want to foreclose on that for our own uses when we are in power. Like, how should the party be navigating?
Exactly. And I'll tell you one way that some Democrats have responded to this in, I think, a 180-degree wrong way, which is to, revitalize the cult of free trade. The Democratic Party had been moving towards a repudiation of corporate free trade. Trump comes along and wants to levy tariffs on every country hither and yon, basically to, be shown to be the powerful guy who can run the world. And some Democrats, I think Rahm Emanuel was one, started to rehabilitate free trade again. So that is exactly the wrong way to do this. Now, some unions have smartly been saying, well, there's a right way and a wrong way, but it's hard to cut through at a level that the public actually notices that kind of inherently nuanced argument. But we have got to make inherently nuanced arguments, or boy, are we throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Trump is the bathwater, but there's still a baby.
Right. I mean, I look at what Bernie Sanders coming out essentially endorsing conceptually, Trump taking equity stakes. I look at that and I say, I think Bernie's right, but I also think Bernie is in political no man's land. Right. Like the average politician getting caught in political no man's land, where the president that they oppose, who they don't trust with the power, is doing something that is based on a principle that could be taken into the right direction. Saying that creates political problems for yourself. I mean, I think about Chris Deluzio as one example, who's been on this podcast, a congressman from Pennsylvania, who came out and said, listen, we should not be saying that just because Donald Trump is doing stupid tariffs, that all tariffs are wrong. And he got flamethrowered by Democrats and people who follow politics only as a team sport. Of course, Bob, I want to come back to you and ask you this question. Is there a slippery slope here? I personally think we're way far away from a slippery slope in the sense of the pendulum has swung so far to just cutting blank checks to corporations where the taxpayers get nothing in return that we're not really near the slippery slope of, oh my God, the government's taking over everything and, it's a command and control economy. Some people are listening to this and thinking, okay, well, fine. They took a stake in Intel. They took a stake in the Japanese steel company. What's next? Where does this end? What's your response to that?
Yeah, I don't see us on a slippery slope to some sort of abusive government takeover of everything, but I do see us on a slippery slope that we're actually considerably well down already toward Donald Trump having control of everything, right? It's just not clear to me that we have the systemic capacity, the political systemic capacity, either to check Trump or to prevent future Trumps once this guy dies, right? And that's where I worry about slippery slopes, I suppose, the most, right? I mean, basically, if we could assume some kind of a recovery of a functioning quasi-democracy, not anything but a perfect democracy, but let's say something a bit like the democracy that we had by the late 1960s or early 1970s after the civil rights legislation had passed and so forth, assuming that we could get back to something like that, as imperfect as that was, then I wouldn't really be all that worried. But it seems to me that we've pretty much eaten away the foundations of the constitutional order itself. And in the absence of such an order, it's not clear to me how we recover anything at all, even after Trump is gone. Like J.D. Vance will just be the same thing, it seems to me. And indeed, I don't see any Republican on the horizon who's not another Donald Trump, only with less charisma, if that's what we would call it. And then, at some point, Democrats will learn a lesson from that and they'll become the same thing. I don't think Rahm Emanuel, for example, is somehow fundamentally at his moral core committed to constitutional principles either. I think he just does what Democrats have historically thought that they have to do to win. And if he ends up realizing or noticing or deciding that doing things Trump-wise is the only way to do things, I'm sure he would essentially be a Democratic Trump or would sort of help create a Democrat Trump. That's where I worry. And I hope that maybe you guys, David, you're not particularly known for being a starry-eyed optimist compared to me, but I'm hoping that you might be able to give me some hope here. And I'm especially hoping that Harold might.
Let's imagine that it's 2029, okay? A Democrat has won office. They have a set of equity stakes, or the U.S. government has a set of equity stakes. I wonder if a Democratic president, after we live through this, we've just talked about the power of negative partisanship to push the Democrats away from even acknowledging that equity stakes could be used for good. I wonder if the Democrats will come to an argument that, frankly, other industrialized countries have come to, which is that equity stakes aren't just a way to prevent downside risks when taxpayers give away money, but that equity stakes and industrial policy itself are necessary to compete in this economy. I'm looking just at examples. You have state-owned or at least state-invested airlines. Mexico has state-sanctioned gas stations. France has an entire government agency that oversees hundreds of billions of euros of investments in business assets. And of course, there's China, who leads the world in producing clean energy, which has all sorts of ownership stakes, equity stakes, et cetera, through sovereign wealth funds and the like. Harold, if you think in 2029, picking up from where the Biden administration left off, we will see a Democratic Party that is more interested in embracing, actually, equity stakes and industrial policy, what's under the umbrella of so-called state capitalism?
I would envision a wholesale return to the kind of industrial policy that Joe Biden implemented. I'm skeptical that the Democrats will go further down the line to increase in a significant way the number of equity stakes in corporations, largely citing the reason that you've been citing since the outset of this discussion, David, which is that Trump has toxified that, and the level of explanation required of a new Democratic administration and a new Democratic Congress, otherwise the administration won't be able to do very much at all, required to say, well, this is a different kind of equity stakes, unless there is a supremely talented Democratic president in the White House. I think they are going to stay away from that. I do envision a wholesale return to industrial policy. But as you've been suggesting, I think equity stakes have been toxified by Donald Trump.
I want to go back to where this conversation started, which was, the Great Depression. And what you laid out about what happened in the Great Depression when the U.S. government was taking ownership stakes in parts of the private sector economy, you laid out something that didn't as much revolve around the one person in the White House, that there were safeguards in the sense of there were appointees, Congress was a more aggressive and assertive branch of government, there were regulators and the like. I guess the question here is, if we are moving into an era of a more aggressive industrial policy and so-called state capitalism, what kinds of safeguards need to be restored or constructed to prevent state capitalism from being the political tool of the dear leader in the White House?
So there's a bill before Congress right now that I drafted for Ro Khanna and Marco Rubio, believe it or not. And they both co-sponsored it. I drafted it back in 2019 when it wasn't clear who was going to win the 2020 election and hence who would be president even in 2021, let alone 2029. It's called the National Reconstruction and Continuous Development Act. Rubio and Khanna together went ahead and introduced it into Congress in 2022. Roe, I believe, has renewed it since then. But it basically puts in place precisely an orderly structure essentially to adopt and formalize and make a permanent part of the sort of structure of governance what seems to me a sort of World War II mobilization style industrial policy, but with all of the sort of formal safeguards that you would hope against corruption by public officials, against illegitimate encroachments upon public prerogatives by private sector institutions or firms or individuals who are sort of part of that structure. And I think it has all the safeguards that you need as well. It regularizes it instead of allowing it to be an individual's prerogative.
I've heard it said that whatever Trump touches dies, right? It's sort of like if Trump touches something, then, and nobody else wants to touch it. We've heard this vision. We know the power of negative partisanship. I wonder if the next Democratic president will find, if not an alliance, will face an emboldened pushback from the old voices of the right, these sort of anti-socialist Cato Institute voices. We see a kind of alliance of these sort of anti-Trump Democrats, the resistance Democrats, and the old line corporate libertarian conservatives to make the kind of vision that Bob laid out and the industrial policies that you've written about, to make that actually harder to put in place than perhaps it was even for Joe Biden. What do you say to that?
One reason why some of the things that the New Deal did vis-a-vis the economy have not been replicated. Certainly in the 1930s, the Great Depression really took the wind out of the sails of folks like the Wall Street Journal editorialists. They kept writing the same thing, but they were not widely accepted as having any relation to what was necessary and what was true. So, yeah, of course there'll be pushback. And Democrats will need leaders like not just Sanders and Warren, but Ro Khanna and others who point to the larger needs of the economy. By the way, I would add one safeguard that was also around during World War II when tax dollars were being used and debt was being incurred by the purchase of all kinds of things from private corporations that was going to the war effort. There was a senator who had a committee that investigated what corporations were doing, what they were up to, where they were cheating, et cetera, because this was costing the public money. And that senator got enough prominence from this that when Franklin Roosevelt felt the need to bump his sitting vice president off the ticket in 1944, he selected him. That was Harry Truman. And so there is a power for Congress, if it can remember why it was created in the first place, to also be a check on the kind of personalization we've seen with Donald Trump.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely worry that the next Democratic president sees what happened, and there is a kind of re-emboldened, what I would call a Rockefeller Republican coalition, which now stretches from the libertarian, old line conservative right to the corporate center of the Democratic Party, that the politics is realigned around that sort of transpartisan coalition. And the next Democratic president, who may want to do some of the kinds of things that Biden did on industrial policy, that the battle will be with that coalition, a Rockefeller Republican coalition by another name. And when that happens, we will all reconvene to discuss what are the next steps. Harold Meyerson is the editor-at-large at the American Prospect. Bob Hockett is a professor of law at Cornell Law School. Thanks to both of you.
Thanks, David. Great to see you again.
Likewise.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Lever Time. Lever Time is a production of The Lever. This episode was produced by Natalie Bettendorf and Ariella Markowitz. It was edited and mixed by Ron Doyle. Our theme music is by Nick Campbell. You can subscribe to Lever Time on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, the PRX mobile app, or wherever you get your podcasts. For ad-free episodes, exclusive bonus content, and access to The Lever's entire archive of investigative journalism, please consider becoming a premium subscriber right now. Head over to levernews.com to learn more about becoming a paid subscriber, or click the link in this episode's show notes. I'm David Sirota. We'll be back next week with another episode of Lever Time.